Welcome to the Naked Soul podcast, where we dissolve the barriers between spirituality and the human experience.
Here, we embrace the full spectrum of your journey, celebrating the highs and the lows, the glimmers and the triggers.
Our mission is to dive deep into the candid conversations that everyone thinks about but few talk about, breaking the silence and removing the stigma around the complexities of being human.
Whether you're on a healing journey, an entrepreneurial path, or anywhere in between.
If you're ready to shatter the notions of spirituality being all love and light and embrace radical honesty and acceptance of your soul's journey here, let's strip away the layers and let's get naked.
Welcome back to the Naked Soul podcast. We're here with episode 3, where we are going to be talking about inner child work through the lens of internal family systems, also known as IFS. So, Shawna, could you please explain to us what IFS work and inner child work is?
Absolutely. So IFS, also known as internal family systems, I like to describe it as a framework for understanding our psyche, basically. And it's an amazing framework. It's probably the most effective and the most comprehensive framework I have found for understanding our psyche, which basically means understanding why we feel the way that we do in different situations, why we think the different thoughts that we think, why we're holding. What it shows you is that we, in so many different situations, we're actually holding on to different belief systems that were formed throughout our life in different situations. And oftentimes these belief systems are actually quite inaccurate. They many times come from what's called wounded parts of ourselves, and we'll get into all of this. But very often they're coming from a wounded lens, a wounded part of ourselves. And what this ends up doing is it actually can cause a lot of suffering. And it can cause us to, it can really limit us. So we can actually be operating from these wounded aspects of ourselves and these, say, limiting beliefs without even realizing it. Mm-hmm. And then this can prevent us. It can make us feel all sorts of uncomfortable emotions in different situations. So think about anytime you're triggered by a different situation, right, or by someone. Oftentimes the trigger, basically the feeling of discomfort, a trigger is basically feeling uncomfortable, right? Feeling some sort of uncomfortable emotion, whether it is anxiety, anger, jealousy, sadness. But basically, a lot of times when you're feeling these ways, when you're in a situation and you feel an uncomfortable emotion kind of arise, it's actually poking at a wounded aspect within ourselves. And it's bringing up these limiting beliefs. They're often very subconscious, though. So this is the benefit of diving into a framework like internal family systems, because we can start to uncover, oh, interesting, like in that situation, why did I feel that way? What was it actually poking at? What was the hidden belief system that was lurking there? And then what the framework also does is it takes it a step further and teaches us how to heal these wounded aspects of ourselves and unburden. It's called an unburdening process. So it's unburdening ourselves from these limiting beliefs and from these belief systems that we've basically been holding on to. Mm-hmm. So that's what it is amazing for. And when I discovered it, it was so eye-opening and so healing. And I just fell in love with the framework. And then when I started teaching it in my courses and on retreats, what was so exciting was that the same response from all of the women, from other people. It was like takeaways. When we shared takeaways at the end of retreats, it was like, what were some of your biggest takeaways? And the IFS framework has been so helpful and so healing to so many people.
I think so many people ask the question of like, why am I this way?
Yeah.
Especially when that kind of light bulb moment goes off of like, okay, I'm a co-creator in my life, in my reality. Why am I creating this experience?
Yeah. And it relates very much to what you said in either the previous episode or the one before that, where you said life can sometimes feel like Groundhog Day, where we're repeating behaviors. Mm-hmm. And we can have these like patterns of either feeling like anxious in these situations or procrastinating or not following through on something. And we're like, why? Why do I keep doing this?
Yeah, I know what I should be doing.
Yeah.
How come I'm not doing it, or what's the resistance to doing it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I thought it would be helpful to explain how I found internal family systems because it actually shows a really cool story of how manifestation works.
Oh, yay. Love a manifestation story.
Yeah, and we'll have an episode on manifestation in the future, but this was just a really cool experience. I think that sometimes people think that manifestation works in the way of like, you put out this desire and then it's like, bam, here you go.
Right. Like,
Yeah, which sometimes it can. I've had some really cool experiences of that as well. But oftentimes it sends you the stepping stones.
mm-hmm.
And that was very much what this was for me. I was putting out the desire for healing and it sent me internal family systems. So cool. So basically, back in 2018, I explained this in episode 1 when my brother passed away. So
Right.
he passed from a accidental drug overdose, and that was laced with fentanyl. So he used substances to soothe suffering within depression and anxiety, as many people with substance abuse use, right? That's why they use them. So he passed in 2018, and that was very challenging. And then when he passed, I was also working as a mental health nurse on a mental health ward.
Mm-hmm.
It was very challenging. When he passed away, I had 4 days off, but it was very challenging to have to go back into working in mental health and basically seeing patients that resembled the same story
Yeah.
that had just played out.
Like they're all your brother.
Yeah. So I was seeing a lot of people with substance challenges. Then I was also seeing, I remember I had a patient, a mother whose son was struggling with substance abuse, and she was my patient. And I just remember looking at her and seeing like the fear within her eyes, and she was like literally shaking about what's going to happen to my son. And I remember I did not have the capacity to work with this client 4 days, like,
Yeah.
the following week after my brother passed away. And so I went to the doctors, and granted, this was not my family doctor because I was living in a city where I hadn't gotten a family doctor. And I went in and I was requesting extra time off. And I explained the situation to him. And he basically looked at me and said, I don't understand the connection. Why do you need time
Wow.
off?
Feels like it should be such an obvious connection.
Yeah. And in that moment, I had been debating going in, and I was like, you know what? No, this is the right thing to do because I was really struggling at work. I was having to like leave the unit to go have moments of grief in the bathroom, and I just knew I was not effective. So I actually thought it was the right thing to do to go into the doctor and just ask for some time off. And I got met with that response, and it triggered all the what we'll explain as parts, but it triggered so many parts within me. The not good enough part, the weak part,
Oh, the weak part.
the weak part. It really brought that one up.
Especially as a woman.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was like the voice in my head was like, see, you should have just kept trekking on. You should have locked this in a box and just like kept going on. And so all these limiting beliefs were coming up, and I decided that that's what I needed to do. So I put that into a box and I said, okay, I'll just access this when I get home on my days off, and we'll keep acting very soldier-like kind of on the unit and do the best that we can do. Continued doing that. So that was in April. Continued doing that for the whole rest of the year. Then came around January, the following January, and I'm now working in the psychiatric emergency department. We are severely understaffed, and I'm in charge. So I'm in charge of the unit. And this one evening, we had 24 patients on the unit for a unit that's built for 6.
Oh my God.
So, and this is not just like, picture people coming in with suicidal thoughts, people coming in extreme psychosis, aggression. We had people coming in with police needing to be restrained, sedated. Then we'd have another person coming in complaining of suicidal thoughts. And now picture 24 of those patients.
Yeah, I can't imagine.
And it's built for 6, so we don't even have the room or like the capacity for it. And I'm in charge. So I come in onto that shift, and right away I'm like, this is a sinking ship. Like, this does not look safe at all.
Mm-hmm.
1 hour into my shift, I can see that we're not handling this well at all. So I call my manager to get approved for extra staff to come in. I explain the situation. He declines the request because it's not within the budget. Everything is always about the budget in the healthcare system. Yeah.
And for those of you listening, if you're not in Canada, we're from Canada. And so we kind of think that our healthcare is free, but it's interesting to have that inside lens where actually, like, it's not really free. Like, there are a lot of corners that are being cut and costs that are being cut.
Yes. Yeah, and it's not funded enough,
Yeah.
even though it's free. And then we're running into a lot of problems as well.
Yeah.
So he declines the request, and I'm like, okay, I just have to keep this ship running, basically. And typically, when you're charge nurse, you shouldn't actually have a whole caseload to yourself, like a patient load. But because there's only 3 staff and 24 patients, I had to have like my own whole caseload plus like organizing the unit and running the unit and making sure it flows. There was a incident that evening, that night shift, where an order was missed on a gentleman, and this gentleman ended up ending his life later on.
And what would an order be?
Yeah, an order there can be orders on anything like this person needs this amount of blood given, or this person needs a medication.
Okay.
Or it can be follow-up orders. So his was a follow-up order, and it was refer this patient to this place, basically this outpatient clinic.
Right.
And that was missed. It wasn't faxed. It ended up being my patient that I missed this order, and I didn't fax that order. So basically the referral did not get sent for his follow-up care. And then I learned that he ended his life after he left the hospital. And of course, all of the thoughts of like, oh my goodness, I pride myself on not say missing orders and just, working so hard as a nurse to do the best job.
Of course.
So I'm like, I do not miss orders. Like, I'm not the type of nurse to miss orders. And this is like a system problem here. Luckily, the man was elderly, which I know every life is precious, but I think that helped me move forward from it, because I think if it had have been like a young individual,
somebody like your brother's age,
yeah, that would have been a lot harder for me to work through. So that was the one thing that I was like, okay, he was elderly and he was towards the end of his life. And I did find out later that he did get referred through another means. So those aspects made me feel better about the situation, but it didn't take away from like why the situation happened. And basically there was a review that was done into this situation, and my manager said, well, how was this order missed? And I'm like, what do you mean?
And is this the same manager that you called
Yes.
to have?
Yes. So I'm like, what do you mean, how was the order missed? Like, yeah. And I explained that. Like, this was the same night that I called you saying, like, this is a sinking ship, in other words, obviously, but like, we need extra staff. And you declined it. And of course, they just kind of like brush it off, right? And he said, okay, well, that's okay. These things happen. That's what he ended up saying.
Right. As soon as it was maybe going to be put on them.
Right. And I was like, no, these things, like, they don't just happen. Like, they don't need to be happening. So that conversation did not sit well with me. And I was sitting at home and thinking about going in for my next shifts, and I started experiencing panic. So I was experiencing lots of panic, anxiety. I sent him an email about the changes. I sent him a whole chart that I created about problems on the unit and changes that could be made to help increase safety on the unit and effectiveness of patient care.
Mm-hmm.
I emailed it to him. His response, he didn't acknowledge it, and he just said, "When are you coming back to work?"
Mm.
So that was a clear message to me that they do not care about safety. They don't care about our emotional health, the trauma that we're basically needing to take on. They just want, you're just a number, basically. That was the message that I was receiving. So the panic kept increasing.
Literally your body just telling you
Yeah.
to get the heck out of there.
Yeah. So I went to the doctors, this time my family doctor, because I was back in the city where I had a family doctor. And she diagnosed me with complex PTSD. And it was a combination of a bunch of things. It was a combination of everything that was happening at work, that situation that happened at work, some other situations that had come up, as well as unprocessed grief from my brother's passing, because she could tell that I was still carrying this into a lot of my shifts and every day, basically. And I hadn't had time to like process it all, basically. Yeah. So she gave me some time off work, very thankfully. And then she recommended that I explore some trauma modalities that can help with trauma, EFT being one of them, EFT tapping, emotional freedom technique. She mentioned that one. And she mentioned some other ones. But for some reason, EFT tapping sat in my head. So it was the following week and I'm running errands. And I ran an errand at the bank. And then I realized that there was this little bookstore that I had parked in front of that I hadn't realized before. And keep in mind, this whole time since my brother passed, I've still been putting out the desire through manifestation practices of thank you for sending me healing. Thank you for sending me healing. Thank you for sending me strength. So I was continuing those practices. And then this doctor mentioned EFT tapping. Then I'm running errands. I see this little bookstore. I decide to mosey into the bookstore. And the lady says, we're chit-chatting, and she says, "Can I help you find anything?" And I say no at first. And then I'm browsing more. And then my conversation with the doctor popped into my head. And I was like, oh, I should ask if there's any books on EFT tapping. So I asked her, I said, "Hey, do you have any books on EFT tapping? It was recommended for me." And she says, "No, I don't have any books, but right across the road is a practitioner who does EFT tapping, and she's amazing at it." And I was like,
oh my God.
Right.
You can't make this stuff up.
Weird. Yeah. And she's like, "I've been to her. She's amazing. She specializes in EFT tapping." And I'm just like, that is so bizarre.
So you moseyed across the street,
So I
right?
mosey across the street. I write down her info. I didn't go in right away. And I looked her up online and I book an appointment with her the following week. And anyways, this is how I discovered, through this person, this is how I discovered EFT tapping, IFS. So she combined tapping with internal family systems and breath work.
Wow.
And you're like, whoa, those are like 3 modalities that A, you love, and B, are like so much a part of my teachings now.
Like I just got chills. That's crazy.
And it was all through that one person that I learned these things.
It was also all through this traumatic event happening.
Which I feel like we talked about this in the previous episode, where it's like you don't realize how sometimes these traumatic, awful things, and you're like, why is this happening to me? But they can actually be leading you to...
Yeah, you don't know the path that it's going to set you on.
Yeah, so it was a very hard experience to go through, but it has led to so much good. And so I had a session with her, and she taught me IFS. She introduced me to IFS and taught me how to do EFT tapping with it. And then later on, I took breath work with her and explored 30 weeks of breath work as well. Yeah. And let me tell you, these 3 modalities, holy cow, have brought me so much healing, so much insight, and like
And have
so
brought so
much
many
shift.
other people so much healing too.
Yes. Yeah. And then once I started teaching them, because I fell in love with all of them and eventually began teaching them. And you're exactly right. Like on retreats, people are like, wow, like so much, like so many insights and healing from IFS and
Yeah.
yeah, and breath work. So, what is IFS? We'll dive
Yeah.
into it.
Tell us
Yeah.
about it. I love hearing about it every time you teach it. I'm like, this is so good.
Yeah, so it was created by a therapist named Richard Schwartz. And the more I learn about him and like how it was developed, I'm just like, this is such a cool story because he began discovering it in the 80s. So it's actually been around for a while, but it's growing in popularity. It is so popular right now that you can't even get into any trainings with it. Like therapists are like running to it.
Wow.
Yeah, and I just looked even a little bit a while ago and it's like fully booked out. So the reason I think it is because it's so effective and it's such a comprehensive framework. It really combines Western views of therapy combined with spirituality,
Yeah.
which is so cool. So he created it in the 80s and basically he created it through it was just interaction with his clients. And what he realized was clients were coming into his office and they were saying, a part of me feels this way and a part of me feels this
I
way.
still say these things. Like even knowing
Yeah.
about IFS, I still recognize the parts.
Yeah. It's actually so cool because now that I know IFS, it's so funny when you're in a conversation with someone and they literally say, a part of me feels this way, but another part of me feels this way. And they're literally like stating it.
Yeah.
Like they're basically saying to you, I have this part within me and this part within me. And that's basically what he discovered is that we all have all these different personalities and they call them parts within us. And what can happen is, well, let's start with the true essence. So we also all have a true essence, which in spirituality, there's so many different terms for this. It could be like your Buddha nature, your Christ consciousness. What are some others?
I call it the soul.
The soul, your true nature, your true essence. They call it yourself.
Yeah, your highest self.
Your highest self. Yeah. So we have this self within us, and I like to describe it to help people understand yourself is I like to open the question as what would you be like if you had no wounding at all? And I love asking that question on retreats because everyone's just like eyes go wide and it's like, whoa, like, and I ask like, what are the qualities you would be if you had no wounding? And some of the answers are, what are some of your answers?
Just love.
Love,
peace, acceptance,
freedom, playfulness is another one a lot of people say, and just, lightness. And that is our true essence. That is who we actually are. And we'll get into this.
Could also make you cry a little bit to think, right?
Yeah. And I'm sure we'll get into more about the soul, the true essence, even from a non-dual perspective. We'll have episodes on that. But this is who we are at our core. Many people can't feel this, and it's actually because we're operating from our parts so much, and we do not realize it. So how do the parts get formed? There's all different parts. There are what's called exile parts, manager parts, and firefighter parts. I'm literally pointing
to where they are
to
on
the
your
diagram,
chart.
the chart that I explained. Yeah. So exile parts are our most wounded. They're the most painful wounds that we can have within us. They can be holding the most painful belief systems and wounds. And some of these are like the unlovable part, the shameful part, the not good enough part, the abandoned part, the rejected part. When I even say these words, you can just feel
it. They're like that wounded little child, like hiding in a corner.
Yes, exactly. So these can get formed, parts get formed basically the belief systems and the burdens get formed through different experiences in childhood. That's when they're most often
Mhm.
formed. They actually say we're born with our parts, but the burdens and the wounds of them come through experiences, basically.
Well, there's so much messaging that's already sent to us when we're in the womb,
Exactly. So
which is
that's when it can
crazy.
first start. Yeah.
Yeah.
So think about, I'm trying to even think about, say a mom has substance use habits, right?
Mhm.
That could even be sending signals to a fetus that this space is unsafe,
Yeah.
something like that, right? So you
Yeah.
could actually start to form a belief system, and you could hold this belief system that the world is an unsafe space, or it's not meeting your needs, it's not nourishing.
Mhm.
Hmm.
One that I know a lot of us have, and that I've seen a lot with my clients, is there's like this generation of parents that through their own trauma were seeking like their children to be the ones who were like filling them and making them feel loved.
Mm,
So these children were literally born with this imprint of like, I'm here to take care of my mother or my parents and to
mm-hmm.
make them happy. And that's where like a lot of our just inherent kind of people pleasing came
People
from,
pleasing,
is
yeah.
yeah, this message through the womb of like, you're gonna kind of be my savior almost.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have that part.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, we can identify parts as we go that we have. Yeah. And a very easy example too, the one I use about the playground a lot on retreats,
Mhm.
is say you're 4 years old and your mom dresses you in a red shirt. You go to the playground and all the kids are wearing, I'm looking at you, green. All the kids are wearing green, and some of the kids laugh at you and they say like, you're wearing a red shirt, didn't you know it's like, that's not cool type
Yeah.
thing, right? And it can be all these like we would look at this and just be like, what a silly situation,
Mhm.
right? But when you're a child, you're taking in this messaging. Like
Yeah.
our brains are like sponges,
And you
right?
don't have the mental or emotional
Yeah,
maturity to
to understand. Yeah, and to be like, your true essence like isn't developed in terms of like speaking strong enough to say to you in that moment like, no, 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 this is just them, they're trying to make themselves feel better and
Mhm.
cool, right? But you're like, green shirts are just as good as red shirts, like there's no,
Yeah, that
that's not going on. As a child, you just take in and you're starting to form belief systems very quickly as a child.
yeah.
So you're basically saying, like, what does this mean about me? That's kind
Mhm.
of what you're always doing as a child. You're taking in a situation and you're trying to like orient yourself in the world. But unfortunately, a lot of times we orient ourselves incorrectly through
Mhm.
like a wounded lens. So that situation might happen, and suddenly we start to say to ourselves, I'm not as good as them. I'm lame. I'm a loser. You start to like, your shameful part can get developed. Like, I'm wearing red. Why would I do that?
Mhm.
They could take off and run away. And then that again is strengthening the abandoned part, the
Mhm.
rejected part.
Yeah.
So one situation can strengthen these burdens that these parts are holding.
Yeah. And then a lot of times the child goes home, tells this story to mom and dad, and they just kind of say like, you shouldn't feel that way.
Yeah, there's so many like mixed messages
Yeah.
in, and I often say that parents have one of the hardest roles,
Oh yeah.
because we've heard on retreats where it's like even like well-meaning things sometimes end up like getting shifted and like not serving the child in the best way, or it like,
Yeah.
it shifts them into a different mode of functioning. Like I remember one person said like the mom was so loving and encouraging, but it almost made her not believe in herself. So
Mhm.
it's so interesting, and then I'm just like, man, parents have such a tough job.
I remember like before I got into this work and really understanding that, like we talked about, our children are meant to go through these experiences for
Yeah.
their soul growth and evolution. But before I understood that, I remember being like, I had such amazing parents who loved me so much, and still they missed so much.
Right.
and still I have this trauma and still there's things,
Mhm.
right? So like I had so much fear before discovering this work of like doing that to a child because
Yeah,
even the best of parents are going to miss something.
exactly.
Yeah.
And I think what's helpful, like when we explain it, say on retreats, we explain it how you can do the best that you can and also know that certain things are out of your control in terms of you don't know what your child needs for their soul growth,
Mhm.
basically, right?
And if they don't get it from you, they might just get it from the outside world or their
Yeah,
teachers and
yeah. And I
yeah.
always tell any moms that are doing this work because I know it can like make them anxious, like, oh gosh, like I don't want to.
Do
What?
this to my
Yeah, I
kid.
don't want to do this to my kid. What parts am I forming in my child? That will actually, so right there, it's actually triggering an anxious part and a
Mhm.
fearful part,
Right.
right? It's right there, it's triggering it.
Mm.
And okay, you can ask yourself what belief systems are coming up from that anxious part. And it's like, I'm not a good enough mom. I don't want to mess up my child. I don't want to be the cause of this, right? And all of that is the anxious commentary of that part, basically.
Yeah.
But I always tell moms that the best thing you can do is start to look at this work and focus on yourself,
Mhm.
because when you start to focus on yourself and healing yourself, that actually will, like, our energy gets shifted outwards.
Yeah.
So if you are creating a more loving and healed environment within, you're going to naturally send out more love. And that's actually the most control. Like if you're looking for control,
Yeah.
we'll talk a lot about control over the course of episodes, but that's the most effective thing that you
Yeah.
can do. Yeah.
Such a good reminder for me.
Yeah. So those would be the exile parts, the most wounded parts. Manager parts get formed because the exile parts are very painful to feel. So basically, we start to develop ways of being in order to protect ourselves from feeling the
Mhm.
exile parts. Both manager parts and the other ones are firefighter parts. They play protective roles. So they're actually trying to protect you from feeling pain,
Yeah.
basically. So, an example of a
So
manager part,
well-meaning.
so well meaning. And this is why he has a book, Richard Schwartz, called No Bad Parts.
Yeah.
Because once you actually, so the goal of the framework is to actually get in touch with all your different parts and form relationships with them and start to connect with them and ask them questions. And when you do this, you actually realize that they're actually playing quite a useful role.
Mhm.
What they're doing is trying to protect you
Mhm.
from pain. And they really believe that their role is needed in
Yeah.
order to protect you from pain. And what you need to do is you need to connect to these parts from your true essence. And basically, you need to see the burdens that they've been carrying, which are like the belief systems they've
Yeah.
been carrying. And you need to help them release and unload these burdens and slowly teach them and coach them that there could be another way.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then from there, it's actually like helping them live in a different way and slowly seeing that your way can be trusted,
Mhm.
basically. So, an example of a manager part is the perfectionist
Yeah.
or the people pleaser. So, we could develop into, if something happened in, okay, going back to that red shirt, green shirt situation, if we felt that if that situation made us feel not good enough, we could develop a perfectionist part that says, okay, I'm going to go find the coolest shirts around. This
Mhm.
is just, it's a silly example, but,
Mhm.
and then you could become a perfectionist with what you're wearing or maybe what
Mhm.
you look like because
Appearances.
appearances. Yeah. Yeah. I shouldn't even say it's a silly situation because
No,
like
these
a lot
things
of people
have
have,
huge impact.
yeah.
I remember I had a grade 1 teacher and I had cut my bangs and I was growing my bangs out. And so I was
Mm,
wearing headbands to keep my
yeah.
bangs back. And she started calling me headband girl.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
And there was even another girl in the class that was, kind of the popular one. And she would be like, oh, like I know that everybody wants to like be like her.
Right.
And so yeah, that was, as an adult, when I thought about it, I was like, oh, it's silly that this is still affecting you. And then I brought
Right.
myself into that like grade one version of Lori. And it's like, I was really hurt and like embarrassed by that. Like, she said it in
Yeah.
front of the class, in front of my
Yeah.
peers.
Yeah.
And I just felt really like uncool.
Yeah. And then that can stick with you.
Yeah.
This feeling of feeling uncool
Hmm.
can really stick with you.
It did.
Yeah. I don't doubt it.
It really
Yeah.
did. Yeah.
And I have it's actually a great example that I use because it's interesting how we both have examples of this. And my example too is I'm trying to remember what grade I would have been in, maybe grade 6, potentially grade 4, but probably grade 6. And I went to Abercrombie with my friend and we bought these, it's either Hollister or Abercrombie, and we bought these really tight shirts, right? And I was so proud that we had the same shirts. And we walked into gymnastics, and my friend was very naturally thin. I was starting to get curves. And I remember my gymnastics coach, I was like, do you like our shirts? And our gymnastic coach said, your friend, I don't want to name names, but oh, she can wear that shirt, but you shouldn't wear that shirt, Shawna.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And I remember being in like grade 6 and starting to look down at my body and being like, looking at her body and looking at my body and being like, okay, what's the difference here? And then realizing, like, oh, okay, so girls that are thin and not curvy, like, they shouldn't wear tight clothes.
Hmm.
Or, sorry, they can wear tight clothes. And me, because I'm starting to get curves, I should not wear tight clothes.
Yeah.
Let me tell you, I still have
A hard time wearing
wearing
tight
tight
clothes.
clothes. Yes.
Yeah,
That has stuck around for a very long time.
I believe it. I try to be so careful about the way that I talk about my body and my appearances when I'm around my stepkids, because
Yeah.
they're at those ages too where they're starting to look outward to figure out what is
Mhm.
right and acceptable. Luckily,
Mhm.
we've come a long way.
Yeah.
Still not, where we want to be, but yeah, those messages, like, they might seem small, but
Exactly, yeah.
they actually have a big impact on us, especially if it's building on deeper wounds, which usually it is.
Yes. Yeah, and I'm sure you've had this experience too where clients are saying like, "No, I can't really remember like anything that made me feel that way,"
Yeah.
right? And we don't realize that it can be these like tiny little situations.
Yeah.
And we don't realize the impact and how these like basically if you had a moment of feeling shame, feeling not good enough, feeling ugly or anything like that, that sticks around in
Mhm.
your psyche.
Mhm.
And we don't realize
Yeah.
how much we carry these things because unless you are processing it, releasing it, and basically correcting that thought in that moment, it's sticking around in your
Yeah.
psyche.
And I think the other thing about the parts work framework that's so beneficial is to see, like, okay, even if I don't remember some of the experiences that created these
Yeah.
parts, like, if I have a perfectionist part,
Yeah.
something happened.
Something. Yeah. And I always tell people that because a lot of people can't remember the specifics, right? Or in that moment.
Mhm.
And I always tell people, like, don't get fixated on that. You don't need to remember the situation. Sometimes it will, like, once they continue working or even through tapping and things like that, the memories can start to come
Come up.
back. But they're not, it's not necessary to completely remember them in order to heal
No,
these
it's more
parts.
important to work with the feeling, right?
It's much more important to work with the feeling. And I think a lot of people can get fixated on trying to figure out what made them feel that way. And that's actually, that almost
That's a
might be another,
manager
I
part.
was just going to say, that could be another part that's just like, it's focusing on the wrong thing to try to feel useful,
Yeah.
but it's actually resisting you to go into like the deeper healing work.
Yeah. So then when do the firefighter parts?
Yeah. So the firefighter parts come in and you can, I love the name because they're trying to put out the fire. So basically okay, you got the exile wounds and we've tried to push them down. So our psyche tries to push the exile wounds down because they're painful to feel. We kind of bury them, basically. And then the manager parts come in and they're trying to manage and like so that we don't feel things. And then basically when a situation happens that actually you start to feel the exile parts a little bit, the firefighter parts get turned on. And they're basically trying to put out the fire and get you. They're protective roles, but in a lot of ways they're distracting mechanisms that are trying to make you so you don't have to feel the exile parts and what's going on. So some examples of them could be the binger, right?
Right.
Some of these roles can also play manager roles and firefighter roles. But say a binger could get turned on when you're stressed, right? A lot of us have that where
just numbing out.
Yeah, we get stressed. And then instead of looking at, okay, why am I getting stressed? Because stress would be a part as well. So instead of connecting with the part and asking, like, why is it stress? Looking at all the thought patterns and the belief systems. Because again, you're always stressed because of belief systems that you're holding.
That's a hard one to hear. I was literally talking to a client about this morning. I was like, there's actually, like, we create the stress.
Yeah.
Our beliefs, our stories create the stress.
Yeah. And to dive into that, A, it can be uncomfortable. B, you do need to take time to sit down and connect with your parts. And a lot of us look for the easiest route out. So say the binger will come in and you'll either turn on Netflix or you'll go and like pour yourself a glass of wine or you'll start to open a bag of chips and you can't stop, right? And you're actually trying to soothe yourself.
Yeah. Can we also have like an avoidant, like excuse firefighter that's just like, oh, you're too busy to like look at that or have time to do that?
Yeah.
Because I feel like a lot of times we like make excuses for why we're not doing the things that like we know.
And to be honest, I would almost put that as a manager
That's
part.
a manager. Yeah.
And so, yeah, like I said, sometimes they can be it really depends on if you're like feeling triggered in the moment. Because if you're feeling triggered and parts are getting turned on, it's most likely like firefighter parts. But if you're keeping busy in order to like not do the work, then that could be a manager part that's actually just keeping yourself very busy.
Yeah, the busy bee. Yeah.
The busy bee. Yeah. We write it as the busy bee. Yeah. So, other firefighter parts can even be like the arguer, where you end up trying, instead of dipping down. This happens a lot in relationships where a situation happens, both people start to get triggered. Instead of dipping down into more of the vulnerable aspects that are getting triggered, because a lot of times in conflict, it's actually a lot of exile wounds that are getting triggered. Things like, I don't feel seen, I don't feel heard, I don't feel loved, I don't feel taken care of, I'm feeling rejected or abandoned. All those are quite the vulnerable aspects. But so many people don't actually want to dip down and have an open, vulnerable conversation like that. So then we stay up in the firefighters and we're just like arguing and we're kind of defensive and
yeah, bringing up the past, well, you did this before.
Exactly. Yeah. Defensive would be another part. The defensive part. And you're basically trying, it's a protective role. You're trying to protect yourself from feeling probably not good enough.
Yeah, I think we've all felt that way before. I know I've had a big defensive part. Yeah.
Yeah, me too. Yep. And mine sometimes isn't even, well, it is a fear of not being good enough. It's also the fear of doing something wrong. That's been a big part within me that I've had to heal.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Yeah, so the framework basically, to come to a place of greater healing, greater harmony, we are to, where people can start and what I guide people through is the easiest way to work with your parts is when we feel them.
Right.
Yeah. So I love to help people use specific situations, and then use that situation to start to break down, okay, what are you feeling in this situation? What parts might be getting triggered here?
Mhm.
And then we work with one part at a time, because it's most effective to work with one part, because every part has a story to tell,
Mhm.
basically. And they need your full attention
Mhm.
and you focusing on them to really hear why they're feeling the way that they're feeling, what their views are on life, on yourself, on other people, what belief systems they're holding on to. And that's
Yeah.
basically why they feel the way that they
That
feel.
makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So my favorite way to do it, my two favorite ways, you could do it through guided meditation, and I have some meditations that guide people through parts work. My favorite way is through journaling
Mm.
and through using a chart that basically asks sequential questions, and we do this on retreats
Yeah.
with people. Yeah. And it just works to connect to the part, to start to explore the part and understand exactly why they're feeling the way that they're feeling, what their root fear is. Because a
Mhm.
lot of times our parts, they're operating in the way that they are because of a fear.
Yeah.
Yeah. A fear of not being good enough, a fear of being a failure, a fear of XYZ.
And they almost like weren't taught that it's okay to feel that way.
Mm-hmm.
I think like being a human, being afraid of failing is like actually a normal emotion that we all share in. So
Mm-hmm.
to be allowed to like be afraid and then maybe have somebody like hold space for you and encourage you and be there for you through it
Yeah.
is really so powerful because like we're not alone in these feelings.
Yeah. Yep, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then after you understand the part's perspective, then you can do some release work, some unburdening work. So that is basically helping the part let go of
Mhm.
that belief system. And then what I love to end with is like healing and reparenting work. So that's basically helping your part kind of reframe their perspectives,
Mhm.
and what parts can actually do when they can actually take on a new role once they've been unburdened. So say they've been in the role of holding this burden, playing this protective role. Once you release that, and if you were to ask your part what they actually want to do now, some of them will say they actually just want to go rest
Mm.
because they've been so exhausted from.
Oh my god, that's so
I
cute.
know. And you can literally tell them to go take like a nap and just rest. Yeah. Others, you could ask them, like, what role do you want to play now? And they could say, like, actually just want to cheer you on.
Yeah.
I want to practice holding these belief systems that actually serve us more.
Yeah, it frees up space, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. And then they can actually just support you in like believing new things, basically.
Wow,
Hmm. Yeah.
that's so powerful. Is there anywhere that listeners can find your IFS framework or resources to do this work?
Yeah. So it is within my Rise program. It has a whole module on there. It's on our retreats. We
Yes.
always have IFS work. And then it will be a part of my new course coming in September as well, Becoming Source. And I also mention it in the book that will be coming out.
Amazing. So lots of
Lots
places
of
to
places, yeah, because it's,
find and dive into IFS.
yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you, Shawna, so much for teaching us about IFS and parts and sharing like a really vulnerable part of your story as well, because I'm sure that so many listeners, whether they're in healthcare or something else, will be able to relate to the themes that happened within that and hopefully give them some hope that whatever is happening in their life right now is going to bring them to a brighter and more beautiful thing. So, thank you so much for sharing and teaching us. Thank you so much, listeners, for joining us again for week 3. And we can't wait to see what episode 4 is going to bring you.
Thanks, guys.